Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our Lunch and Learned here today. It looks like we're maybe having some issue with Facebook, so Pam will be looking at that, but we are live on YouTube at this time. My name is Marcy Mallory. I'm the president of the Pennsylvania Parks and Forest Foundation, and as with past Lunch and Learns, if you have a comment or a question, feel free to put it into the comment section of either YouTube or Facebook, and we'll be sure to address it as the program proceeds. Today we have with us Mr. Samuel Black. He is the Director of African American Program at the Senator John Heinz History Center. Mr. Black has over 28 years of experience in museum and historical society institutions. He has served as a manuscript curator for some of the most important historical resources in African American history. He is an award-winning curator, writer, editor, lecturer, and researcher. I encourage you to visit his LinkedIn profile, which we will post in the comments to learn more about his work. Today, Mr. Black will be talking about the award-winning exhibit From Slavery to Freedom, for which he served as the project director. Mr. Black, welcome and thank you for being here with us today.
Well, it's really a pleasure to be here and to share my work and the work of the Heinz History Center.
Excellent. Well, I understand you're going to talk to us a little bit about your work that you have done, and you have a PowerPoint slide for us, and then we will ask you some questions. Will that work as a way to proceed?
Yes, that's exactly what we want to do. Let me just pull up the PowerPoint here.
We should do that. And again, if you were trying to watch this on Facebook, we seem to be having an issue. YouTube is working. Pam is working to address that. And are you able to hit the share?
Yeah, but it's not coming up. Just a minute here.
Pam is in the background there. She can also assist.
Okay.
So if you're just joining us, we are here today with Mr. Samuel Black. He is the director of the African American Program at the Senator John Heinz History Center. We're working on getting up a PowerPoint to learn more about his work and the award-winning exhibit From Slavery to Freedom.
Well, while I continue to work on that, I'll go ahead and talk.
Okay.
My name is Samuel Black, and I've been at the Heinz History Center for 19 years now, and it's really been a thrill for me to continue my museum career at the Heinz History Center. And what you don't see, and which I really want to talk about, is a little bit more about the Heinz History Center. If some of you are not familiar with the institution, we mark our founding to 1879, which makes us the longest and oldest continuously run cultural institution in the city of Pittsburgh. It is one of the largest museums in terms of size, history museums in terms of size in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we're very proud of it. The History Center is actually has a family of 5 different museums. We do business as the Historical Society of Western Pennsylvania. So the Senator John Heinz History Center is one of the 5 properties that we operate. The others are the Meadowcroft Rock Shelter and Historic Village, and the Fort Pitt Museum, which we manage in partnership with the PHMC. And we also had a Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum that opened around 2004, and the Thomas and Katherine Detre Library and Archives. So we're really proud, and we're actually looking to expand, but you'll hear a lot more about that in the years to come. COVID has put a sort of a kibosh on some of those plans in terms of the progression of them. And so maybe in a few years, we'll be able to announce some of the new changes and additions to the Heinz History Center. And while I'm talking, I'm continuing, and for some reason, my screen share that was working fine before we went live, and all of a sudden decided not to work.
Yeah, it literally disappeared as we went live. So that was.
So yeah, so what I'm gonna do is email it to Pam and see if she could share it that way. And
we have to learn to be flexible, don't we?
very much so. Let's see here.
So as you're doing that, I'm not familiar with Meadowcroft. I'm familiar with some of the other locations that you've mentioned, and I've been to them, but not familiar with Meadowcroft.
Meadowcroft is located in Avella, Pennsylvania, which is about 30-minute drive south of Pittsburgh. And it is the site, we call it Meadowcroft Historic Village and Rock Shelter. It is the site of probably the oldest living habitat for human habitat in North America, and going back 19,000 years. And let's see here.
Hard to get your head around 19,000 years.
Yes, 19,000 years. And, you know, just okay. I was trying to, sorry about this. I was really trying to get Pam's email, and, you know, so I had to do some things here.
You do that, and I will just, you know, again, remind people, you know, we're having a little technical difficulty. If you can stay tuned and be patient as we're doing the presentation. If you have a question or a comment, you can leave it in the comment section of either the Facebook or YouTube, and I'll be sure to monitor those posts and ask the questions of Mr. Black. So
thank you. Okay.
There we go. We are up.
You have the website up?
We have From Slavery to Freedom up, yes.
Okay.
So it's my understanding that you were the project manager for this exhibit.
Yes, From Slavery to Freedom was an interesting exhibition in terms of how it was developed. When I started at the History Center in 2002, there was an existing exhibition related to Pittsburgh and the Underground Railroad called the Underground Railroad, A Journey to Freedom. And so I was asked to review it, make comments on how to change it or improve it and things like that. So I said it was interesting in the way that it was installed. It was a series of kiosks placed inside the core exhibit. The core exhibit was on the history of Pittsburgh. And so I thought it was kind of odd. So my suggestion was that it needed to come out, be placed in its own gallery so the storyline could be expanded upon. Shortly after that, I started working on other projects. So there was possibly about a 10-year period between my recommendation and when From Slavery to Freedom was completed. We were fortunate enough to get a large grant from the U.S. Department of Education to work on this project. And it allowed me to do a number of different things that I always wanted to do, was tell the story of African Americans in Pittsburgh in the context of the African American experience in the U.S. So it took us back to West Africa, and to West Africa, and so it um, chronicles, in a sense, West Africa. And what you're looking at is actually our website, and the From Slavery to Freedom portion of the website. And so it talks a little bit about, as I mentioned, West Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, slavery in the Americas, the whole plantation system, something that I look at it from an economic standpoint, not so much a labor standpoint. So in that section, we talk about some of the major cash crops that changed the landscape for not only Europeans and native of peoples of the Western Hemisphere, but also Africans. And then within that context, we talk about sugar, cotton, um, rice, indigo, wheat, a number of other cash crops, but the major ones are sugar, cotton, and rice, because they have such an impact. This section of it, Chapter 5, Surviving Off the Land, really deals with a lot of the original research that I conducted in terms of looking at the means to which fugitive slaves, or what we call in the exhibit, freedom seekers, survived their trek to freedom. And in our research, we found people coming as far as Mississippi and Alabama, Tennessee, the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, north, crossing the Mason-Dixon line, either in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, and so forth, in search of freedom. And so we wanted to look at how these people were able to survive living off the land, basically. So we looked at those different plant species and foods that they utilize for sustenance, to build shelters, to make medicines, and also to build weapons and tools and so forth. And a lot of this research revealed to us something. It was a lot more, but we limited it to a little bit over 50 different plant species that we studied and looked at. And uh, something as simple as rice, as you can stop there, as you can see, some of the plant species that included fruits, something as simple as apples, grapes, berries. And we researched, in addition, we looked at all of the uses of, fruits and herbs, and flora, different vegetables, and then cash crops as well. So some, for instance, tree nuts, and different trees were used not only for the fruit of the nuts, but not all tree nuts were edible. But there were other uses, like using the bark of some trees to make soles of shoes, and using the roots of some plants to make medicines or coffee substitutes. We do know that someone like Harriet Tubman, for instance, at times would carry a vial of paregoric, which was a derivative of opium. And she would use that for the children who would be on the journeys to freedom. And it was served almost like knockout drops. So if you're running away and you have slave catchers after you, you don't want 2-year-old children to be screaming and hollering. So it sounds a little brutal, but those are the things and the risk that freedom seekers took to become free and to reach Pennsylvania and other points north in non-slave holding territories and states. So was a major part of the research that I had conducted. And you know what? My screen share seemed to have finally worked. I don't know if you can see that screen.
Yes, we can.
Oh, great. That's the Heinz History Center. It takes up, I'm going to talk real fast now because I've already talked about this. So it takes up one entire city block. And, uh, as you can see there, there is one of my latest exhibits, the Vietnam War, 1945 to 1975, which won some awards as well as the PA Museum's S.K. Stevens Award, among others. But that is the center, the John Heinz History Center, located in the Strip District in downtown Pittsburgh. And these are some of the museums, different museums in the Historic Society of Western Pennsylvania family. In addition to the Heinz History Center, there's Meadowcroft, Fort Pitt, the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum, and the Thomas and Katherine Detre Library and Archives are located inside of the Heinz History Center. And this is the Meadowcroft Historic Village and Rock Shelter. That is the rock shelter in that area there, an observatory, which you can probably see from the people at the platform at the top. And you can look inside, and you can see the cave, and you can see all the archaeological markings from the dig and the research that was conducted there. And this is Fort Pitt Museum, located at the point in downtown Pittsburgh at the point of the triangle. And Fort Pitt Museum, which covers the history not only of Fort Pitt, but more or less pre-colonial and colonial history of the Three Rivers region. And then I mentioned the Western Pennsylvania Sports Museum, which is about a little over 20,000 square feet on 2 floors in the Heinz History Center complex. Takes up the 2nd and 3rd floor of the Smithsonian wing in the complex. And then there's the Thomas and Katherine Detre Library and Archives. That's the reading room of the Library and Archives. And we host school groups, some college classes at times, but many researchers and people who just want to research everything from their family history to journalists who come in researching a story, people working on their graduate degrees, and whether it's a thesis or dissertation and so forth. And then the African American program that I am the director of, we concentrate on these particular areas in collections, both archival and museum collections, exhibitions, public programs that include our From Slavery Freedom film series, which we show 6 films a year, publications, which I'll talk about later, research I'll also talk a little bit about, in addition to the From Slavery Freedom research. Consultation, we consult everyone from, I mentioned, graduate students, people who are making documentary films, or people who are publishing books, teachers, and so forth. And then we also work closely with our education division, which we call the Learning Team, to develop school group tours and other types of programs that are impactful in terms of education. From Slavery Freedom, this is the part of the entrance to the exhibition. It opened in 2012. It's part of our long-term exhibits. And for us, long terms mean it has a life of 10 years. It's 9 years old now. Time really flies. But it'll probably be around for a very long time. We continue to make upgrades to it because I continue to do research. So we go back in and we may change things if we find that we need to correct some information or something like that. We add artifacts to help carry the stories. So we're continuing. It's a living exhibition in a sense. You can see one of the figures on the platform, this particular area. And what I was trying to do was develop environments. So this is the slave ship environment. And you can see the graphic on the floor and on the wall straight ahead that pretty much is gives you the sort of slave ship idea, and the walls of the slave ship. We even have audio sound of the waves hitting the sides of the ships, the chains that and manacles that are holding the captives. You can hear those. But we have two figures. One you can see partially as a 17-year-old boy, which was the average age of those nearly 10 to 12 million captives that were taken through the Middle Passage. And a platform above that, you probably can't see very much. Near the lights, just to the right of the lights, is a 12-year-old girl laying down. The graphic straight ahead where it says a floating dungeon, those are women. The men would be placed in the hull of the ship on the bottom. So this graphic came from the slave ship Brooks, 1787, and was drawn by British abolitionists. And so the exhibition is one of our more popular exhibitions, especially now when people have a heightened interest in learning more about the African American experience. But there are other galleries in this exhibit that carry the story to the plantation systems in the Americas, where some of the major cash crops, including sugar, rice, and cotton, really advanced the economics for European countries, but also for colonial America, the United States. And people ask, why rice? Rice for a number of different reasons. One is rice is indigenous to West Africa. And rice was the #1 starchy food in colonial America, and produced primarily in the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, and sometime and along the Gulf Coast, Mississippi and Louisiana Delta area. West Africans who had been cultivating rice for since 1800 or so BC, and rice was a major crop in West Africa, and you have entire rice societies from the Senegambia area all the way to Liberia, are the major, or at that time were major rice producing areas. And some people, slaveholders in the Americas, people like Henry Lawrence, who was a major financier of the American Revolution, was also a holder of numerous rice plantations in the South Carolina Low Country, but he was also a insurance and insurer of slave ships, and ran in his partnership some of the slave markets in Charleston, South Carolina. So in a sense, he sort of cornered the market on everything related to slavery, from controlling the human product, which were the people, the captives who were enslaved, to ensuring the ships that brought them across the Atlantic Ocean, to producing the crop, rice. And so these are the types of things we talk about in the exhibit, where we get to that type of detail. But we also talked about the means that the enslaved used to escape in that. So I'll get back to the exhibition and the research related to the exhibitions later. But now I want to talk a little bit about the publications. In 2006, we opened an exhibit that I curated called Soul Soldiers, African Americans in the Vietnam Era. And I did this because I wanted to, the History Center had previously opened before I started, actually a year before I started. an exhibit called Eyes on the Prize, and which was about the civil rights movement in the United States. And so when I came aboard, I did not want to do another civil rights exhibit per se. So I said, well, one of the other major um, events or historic events of the 1960s and 70s was the Vietnam War. And you can still talk about civil rights when you talk about the Vietnam War. So I created, without any collections, we didn't have collections, and we had to build collections for the museum and archive with this exhibition. So we were able to use the exhibition to get donations from Vietnam veterans and their families, and a lot of photographic work, a lot of material culture came through from these veterans. And we told the story of African Americans in the Vietnam era. And at the same time I was curating the exhibit, I was also publishing or writing a book. And initially the plan was to do a monograph. And it became so difficult to curate an exhibit and write a manuscript at the same time that I decided, oh, okay, let's stop. And I've done a lot of research. Let me get some other researchers in on this book idea. So I asked for contributing essays and articles from historians, from poets, and even from artists. The book contains, because I wanted to attract, make the book attractive to a museum audience, and not just an academic publication. So I included the art produced by Vietnam veterans. There was poetry there, poetry that was written by Vietnam veteran poets. So everything was about Vietnam veterans in this book. I'm very proud of it, very proud of the exhibition. Again, a recipient of the S.K. Stevens Award at PA Museums, and the AASLH Award of Merit as well. And it opened in 2006 on Veterans Day 2006, closed on Veterans Day 2007, and then in 2008 it traveled to 7 different cities across the country, initially opening, I believe, in Chicago, at the DuSable Museum of African American History in Chicago, and then traveled across the country. It was seen by over 650,000 people.
Wow.
From 2008 to 2011. So we're, really proud of that. So when in 2019, when I then curated the Vietnam War 1945 to 1975, I already had a good foundation for talking about Vietnam. But that newer exhibit, the later exhibit rather, was not solely focused on the African American experience. And so, but it included, and it was a partnership because it was a traveling exhibit from the New York Historical Society. We doubled the content of the exhibit, and it grew from about 4,000 square feet initially to about 8,500 square feet. And the portions that we doubled were basically the Pittsburgh and Western Pennsylvania stories. So we were really proud of doing that. So a lot of my research for Soul Soldiers, I continue to work on today because I'm continuing to write articles about that. The other publication, The Civil War in Pennsylvania, The African American Experience, was published in 2014, and this again was connected to the From Slavery to Freedom exhibit. This publication, The Civil War in Pennsylvania, was a partnership, publishing partnership with the PHMC, which is Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, who were initiating the Pennsylvania Civil War Sesquicentennial and the 150th commemoration of the Civil War in Pennsylvania. And so the Heinz History Center agreed to publish two books, one on the Civil War in Pennsylvania, which was a pictorial book of different photographs from the era of Pennsylvania's in connection with the Civil War, whether they were soldiers or nurses or politicians or just regular people. And then also this book on the Civil War in Pennsylvania, African American experience. And I learned my lesson from the Soul Soldier Project, so I did not try to do a monograph. This book initially started as one with contributing writers, and but the interesting thing in both books, because I don't consider myself necessarily a traditional um, uh, war historian, a historian who writes about war. I write about war from the perspective of the people, not necessarily the blow by blow or the battles of war. So in the Civil War book, I start out with Henry Highland Garnett speaking at a Black male convention in Buffalo, New York in 1843, 18 years before the start of the Civil War, in his famous speech where he says, "Let your motto be resistance." And it's a speech he's delivering to the nearly 3.9 million enslaved Africans in the United States. And he's telling them to resist slavery and resist by any means necessary, which is a term we got or phrase we got used to hearing from Malcolm X, but Henry Highland Garnett said it first in 1843. And it's such a powerful thing, but that's how I start the book off in my introduction, is to say that from the African American standpoint, they were already at war before 1861. And Henry Highland Garnett's speech in 1843 is an indication of that. They were in war in their minds, they were in war in their actions. And part of war for them was the whole aspect of escaping from slavery. So there are other contributing articles and essays in the book that deal with African Americans in the Civil War era in publication. And then also the last thing I want to talk about, going back to the From Slavery to Freedom Project, is the research aspect. And what I try to do with each exhibition I do is bring something new to the body of knowledge. And what I did with From Slavery to Freedom is I focused on, as I mentioned before, how those freedom seekers were able to sustain their lives until they got to free territory. And so I researched these different plant species, and everything is something as simple as I mentioned before as apples, berries, and those types of things. And this is a botanical drawing of red raspberries. And just to give you some idea, and you can find this on the website that was up before. If you click on the raspberry on that website, you will get a message that talks about, and it says this, quote, "A wild red raspberry was edible. Um, African Americans used it to make preserves, jelly, marmalade, wine, and liquor. The leaves are an astringent, and the root is a diuretic. A cordial beverage was made to ward off dysentery." So it is that type of context that I research these plants to find out exactly how did these African Americans use it for foods, and then for medicine, some of the plants. Not all the plants were used in that way. Some were used strictly just to make tools. And in this research, I researched a lot of the slave narratives. I researched formerly enslaved memoirs to find out a little bit more about their stories of their escapes and so forth. Um, and also in connection with this, we also looked at different regions. And so some of these plants grew from the region of the Gulf of Mexico to the Pennsylvania border, the Mississippi River to the Atlantic Ocean. So I took a wide area of basically antebellum United States, and in particular focus on movement from not only the Southeast or the South, that held most of the enslaved, um, but also the region of the north of the Mesa-Dixon line. Um, and then I also looked at the Caribbean as well as Mexico, because these are all areas the freedom seekers went. They did not all go from the south to the north, but also southwest, west, northwest, north, northeast, and southeast. Um, and so it really gave me an opportunity to expand on the body of knowledge about freedom seekers, the Underground Railroad, etc. That it's not just a U.S. Canada phenomenon, but it is much broader than that. And so that meant that the research in terms of how these freedom seekers were able to survive becomes much broader in context and becomes very regional. So there were plants and so forth and foods that were edible that the enslaved knew and understood about. Um, some were very, very familiar with some of the same types of plants and foods in Africa. So in this study, we also included things like the American yam or sweet potato, because that type of starchy food is very similar to the African yam. It doesn't actually look like, as the African yam is a huge, almost looks like a tree branch, and the skin of it looks like bark. But it's a starchy food that was used almost in the same way. And what you will find on a number of these plantations in the South primarily was that sweet potatoes were cultivated. Um, and I mentioned rice before being cultivated. So rice being a major cash crop, and sugar being a major cash crop. Sugar primarily cultivated along the Gulf Coast, in areas of Louisiana, Mississippi, and so forth, but also in the Caribbean. So this research looked at major sugar producing areas of Cuba, Jamaica, Antigua, and so forth, and looked at the different dynamics. Sugar being one that a type of cash crop that was not native to West Africa, but European plantation owners decided to use sugar because it's very profitable. And it took up a lot of land. So you had sugar plantations in Jamaica and Antigua, some as large as 10,000 acres, just huge areas. And for those areas, you needed hundreds of enslaved people to cultivate and produce that crop. And this is part of the growth of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, was producing sugar, not only working in the mines in the earlier period of the enslavement in the 15th and 16th century, but when you get to sugar in the 16th century and on, because of the plantation used so many enslaved, not only because of the territory and the large acreage that the plant was cultivated on, but also because the lifespan for those enslaved on sugar plantations averaged somewhere between 7 to 8 years. So if you remember that 17-year-old young man on that platform in the slave ship portion of From Slavery to Freedom exhibit, probably would not see the age of 30 if he was enslaved on a sugar plantation. If you've ever seen sugar cane, a sugar cane plantation, sugar grows to 12 to 14 feet tall. The leaves are serrated. They're as well as some portions of the stalk are serrated. It's very difficult. It's almost like bamboo. But you have not only the environmental conditions, the conditions in handling the plant itself, but then you have to deal with the snakes, the cane rats, and so forth in that area. And so if you got bit by a snake, you most likely would die or your limb would be amputated. And if if you could not help produce the crop, you were useless to the plantation owners. So all of these things were factors in the mortality of enslaved on sugar plantations. Similar phenomenon for cotton plantations in the American South. Um, Again, you're looking at the environment, producing something in tropical areas, working from sun up to sundown. Um, your nutrition was not the best. And the plants that you are cultivating themselves have health problems. In terms of cotton, a lot of people would get cuts almost like a paper cut. And those things get infected, and again, sometimes people had limbs or fingers and so forth amputated or got infection, and gangrene would grow in. All those things cut into the mortality rates. We know that the infant mortality rates on rice plantations, in particular in the South Carolina low country, was very high. And that most children did not live past the age of 12 or 15 if they were born on a rice plantation in the Carolinas. So what the slaveholders do, they continue to bring slaves from West Africa. And this is the growth of enslavement in the Western Hemisphere. When we talk about that, 10 to 12 million captives from West Africa, that feeds into these plantation systems, very much so, and had a great effect. So these are all some of the topics and things that we talk about in the From Slavery to Freedom exhibit at the Center, the John Heinz History Center. I don't know if we have any questions or comments at this time, but I'm more than happy to address anyone's questions or comments.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you want to continue to show your slide or if you want to bring yourself back up onto the screen, but it seems you have hundreds of years of history in the exhibit that you had to distill down to the exhibit. How do you go about taking all of the information and deciding what goes into the exhibit and which are the most important stories to tell? Because they're all important stories. How do you prioritize the stories?
I started out thematically. I actually had a team of about 14 advisors, some of the leading experts on not only slavery, the slave trade, but also on the African American experience in Pittsburgh and in Western Pennsylvania. So I had 14 advisors. I actually had an expert on African rice cultivation, who happens to be my wife, but she's a PhD at Carnegie Mellon University and is one of the leading experts on African white rice farmers. So I couldn't go wrong in that sense. And but looking at the history itself and knowing and understanding from my research what the major impacts were on slavery in America. So in terms of the section in the gallery that I call the plantation system, I looked at it from an economic standpoint. And I'll go back to rice again. One of the things that I mentioned is that rice is a product, a cash crop in a sense, always has been a cash crop, but a food that was produced by Africans, 1800 years before the birth of Christ. And that's a tremendous thing to know and understand. So for Europeans who did not produce this type of rice, but wanted to produce this type of rice, had to rely on the technology and the expertise of the African. So the people who you are enslaving to produce this product are the experts in producing the product. And some of the plantations, rice plantations that still exist in the South Carolina Low Country, still have some of the same irrigation systems that were built by the enslaved hundreds of years ago. And it's a tremendous thing to go there and to see these things, these different types of dikes to control these canals. We do know because we've seen the archival evidence of plantations owners putting in orders for West Africans who are experts in producing, in digging canals, in digging irrigation systems, and cultivating rice. And I mentioned Henry Lawrence is one of those people who we know more from the American Revolution, but he was one of those who was deeply involved in the slave trade and in rice production in the South Carolina Low Country. So that's in sort of, having that historical background and understanding. It was more or less, how am I going to lay this out? So we decided not to do the exhibition in a chronological form, but more or less a thematic form. So the themes were, and I mentioned the different galleries in the exhibit were different types of environments. So there's the slave ship environment, there's the plantation environment, there's the wilderness environment, there's the antebellum urban environment, and then there's the within the Black communities in those urban environments. There are different galleries that address those environments. There's a Civil War battlefield environment. And then there's the 20th and 21st century urban environment, which we look at, the connections between, for instance, the civil rights movement and the abolitionist movement. So that type of thing, we kind of bring that out in the last gallery of the exhibition.
Thank you. I had visited the microsite, and I believe Pam put the microsite URL up earlier in the conversation, and it really is a tremendous resource. And if people aren't able to immediately get out to the Heinz History Center to see the exhibit, the microsite is a great place to get oriented and get some additional information.
Mm-hmm.
When we were visiting the microsite online with you, and you were talking about the foods, the question came into my mind: were the freedom seekers timing their flight with the availability of some of these foods so that they would have the sustenance that they would need to reach their destination, whether they were traveling north, south, west?
Yes, I did find that in some of my research. And one of the people who wrote his memoirs in the early 1900s, but who escaped slavery in 1844 and made his way in Virginia and made his way north through Pittsburgh, and later settled and lived out the majority of his life in Northeast Ohio. In his memoirs, he talked about that. And one of the reasons he decided to free himself and seek freedom was that his family was sold to different plantations, and he was left, just he and his brother were left, and they decided to escape together. His brother decided to remain in northeastern Virginia, north central Virginia, somewhere around the Morgantown area, but he was still in slaveholding territory, being in Virginia. And his other gentleman decided to go forth in Pittsburgh. And once he arrived in Pittsburgh, he was involved in the underground network in Pittsburgh. They helped him move on. He initially went to Michigan and later to Canada, and then came back and served in the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, settled permanently and lived out the rest of his life in northeastern Ohio. But it was that type of thing that really helped me understand, because in his memoirs he talked about when they chose to leave, and a lot of it dealt with the availability of those that they heard about from the network who could help them, feed them, clothe them, but also when they were on their own, when was the best time. Many of these people traveled at night because the cover of darkness would assist them. And so they relied on the natural environment to build shelters. In my research, I found someone like people are familiar with William um, Wells Brown, who escaped. And Wells Brown talks about in his memoirs of sleeping during the day in a certain type of bush that he would dig and sleep under that bush because it would provide great cover. So he didn't mention the name of the bush. So then I had to go back in my research to try to find out. I think it was this particular bush based on where he said he was when it happened. So those types of things I was able to find in my research. If you're traveling at night, which meant that you would eat at night, or if you were um, capturing any animals, there will be animals who are out at night. So one of the things when I talk to school children is um, you have to drop your inhibitions and when you're looking at history, because especially this history, because people did what they had to do to survive.
Right.
And if you're traveling at night and you're hunting at night, what are you going to catch? You're going to catch animals who are out at night. You're going to catch rats. You're going to catch snakes. You're going to catch, possum. You're going to catch things that we dare not eat today. But it's a different time and a different reason, for that. So those are some things that I pulled out of the research, and I continue to do this because I'm still working on the manuscript for this portion of the work. But some of it I did put into the microsite.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you're spending time outside, you can look at these plants with a different lens, knowing how they sustain life as people were seeking their freedom. Oh.
Exactly. And I'll tell you a story. When I started this research, I live in Pittsburgh, right across from a city park. And my son was probably about 4 years old, I think, at the time. And he would go over to the park and he would pull these dandelions up and he's going to give his mother some flowers, right?
Mhm.
And I had this beautiful golf course green lawn that I love. They bring these dandelions, and so yeah, over from that point on, my lawn is like a dandelion haven. But when I started my research, and I found out that dandelions were one of the plants that provided sustenance and medicine and so forth for these freedom seekers. I felt guilty destroying the dandelions that my son had cultivated on my nice lawn. So to this day, I do not pull the dandelions. I let the rabbits eat them, but I dare not touch them because I know and understand the role that it played in the enslaved efforts to survive their trek to freedom.
Yes, yes, very, very true. I just out of curiosity, what was the bush that they used to?
I'm still working on that.
Okay.
That William Wells Brown used. He describes it, and I have a group of different types of plants that I think they are, and I probably need to talk more directly with a botanist or someone like that to really get it. But and then other research looking at different things, oak trees because they were stronger, and people would climb trees and sleep in trees like a leopard in Africa or somewhere. People would sleep in trees. They were doing everything they could to in the daytime to conceal themselves. There's a great story that actually came from my wife, and I write about it in the microsite. A story of a gentleman called Gullah Jack, and escaped in the South Carolina Low Country, and how he covered his body in the type of mud from the streams. He hid himself from slave catchers um, by sinking himself in the stream, and he then made a raft to be able to travel through the waterways using the cotton, because in addition to rice, cotton was another major cash crop that was cultivated in sea islands. But using cotton, wood planks, and tar, with what she describes as pitch, to make these rafts and shelter. It doubled as a raft as well as a shelter for his escape from slavery. And so, the usefulness, the industrialness of these freedom seekers is just tremendous in what I'm finding in my research. Everything that they were knowledgeable about. And there's one thing I need to back up on. In some slave societies, it was the what I call the and what Charles Chestnut in his novels called the conjure people. These people who knew and understood the properties of different plants and herbs and so forth, who kept people healthy on the plantation because they didn't have medical service like we do today. But they also kept their enslavers healthy in the slave society. And so these people were very resourceful. And there's all types of stories that I came across about what type of year or what time of year do you prepare certain types of remedies. Everything from remedies from green apple seeds or remedies from different types of herbs and so forth. All of that information I'm gathering through my research and using that information.
Yeah, all good research, and timing is everything with some of the plants, because if you get it
Mhm.
at the wrong period of time, it could go from beneficial to toxic. Yeah.
Exactly, and that's one other plant that a lot of people know about and people still cultivate today is pokeweed.
Hmm.
If you pick it and eat it at the wrong time, it can kill you. It's very poisonous, but it's very delicious if you do it at the right time. And so it's these types of things. And actually, one other group who has I've relied upon for feedback and also for a portion of the research in From Slavery to Freedom was the African American Genealogical Society chapter here in Pittsburgh. Um, they did a great deal of research for the exhibit on a collection of what we call manumission papers that were transferred to us from the Allegheny County Deeds and Property Office. And these are transactions of manumissions or emancipations, um, certificates of freedom, freedom papers, and uh, 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 indenture filings, um, all based on what happened in Pennsylvania from March 1st, 1780 on. And that's when the Gradual Abolition Act went into effect in Pennsylvania. And so in the Allegheny County here in Pittsburgh, we have all these different types of documents. And so I was interested in taking those documents and trying to find out more information about the African Americans mentioned in those documents, but also the white folk who were mentioned in those documents. People who were either the slaveholders who were emancipating their slaves, or the people who were the clerks at the deeds office who had to sign the
Mhm.
documents and so forth. So we were researching everybody in those documents. And the one genealogist was able to find two descendants of some enslaved people who were emancipated in the 1840s, or emancipated, some of them earlier than that, but their documents were filed in Allegheny County in 1840s. And we found families, and one interesting part of that was one of the families was living in Northern California, and the family is white and had no idea that they had this enslaved ancestry. And so we sent them copies of, our findings and our research and everything. And they were really just blown away. At least one half of the family. The other half of the family didn't want to. I don't want to hear that. But now that they find that they have African blood, you know, in them. And so we were doing our research, we were able to trace the transition from Africa to American white, and presented all of that information to the family. And we talk about it in the exhibition as well. Yeah, and we saying that this is also America. This is a part of who we are, and that slavery involved all of us, whether you were involved or not.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Well, we're running out of time. I want to thank you for being here. This has been very informative. I'm looking forward to visiting the exhibit. Getting my COVID shot later this week, so I'm sure
Okay.
to move around very soon.
Yes. Yes.
And as I mentioned again, the microsite is a great place to start if you can't get to it right away. And I also want to thank you for the work that you're doing. There are a lot of untold stories, and you're really bringing those stories to light. And I think we need to do that. So thank you for that. As a final wrap up, I would just say if somebody wants to delve deeper into African American history, what one or two recommendations might you have for them? Places they could look for additional information or other exhibits that you would recommend outside of yours?
Yeah, there's so much. Of course, the Smithsonian Museum of African American History is one place if they could go there. And there's so many great publications coming out now. I'm a little partial to the work of the late John Hope Franklin, whose book I took the title of his book, From Slavery to Freedom, for my exhibition. I did get permission from his family to do
That's
that.
good.
But I'm a little partial to his work because I knew him, and his research is just an American treasure. But the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, is another museum. But there's so many different museums that cover this in Pennsylvania. The African American Museum in Philadelphia is just a wonderful place. And of course, the State Museum, and a lot of the work at the State Museum that was previously done by one of my late friend and colleagues, Eric Smith. And so there's so much that is there. And, people can contact me at the Heinz History Center for more information if they want something specific. I'm more than happy to share with them, sources that they can look for, and whether it's related to my work or not. If it's about African American history, I'm more than happy to help.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Mr. Black. I've really enjoyed
Thank you.
having a conversation with you and learning more about your work. And as you're looking more at the botany and the plants in Pennsylvania, feel free to reach out. Maybe we can help you and share some of our knowledge.
I definitely will. Thank you.
Okay, great. If you want to stay on, we're going to end the broadcast now, but we'll chat with you for a few minutes. So thank you to everybody that was here today. The broadcast will remain on YouTube and Facebook, so feel free to share it with others. Thank you.